Hey ladies, welcome back to class. We're going to be learning about homeostasis this week. Hopefully you've already read the chapter so you have a basic idea of what we're going to be covering today. Otherwise, let's just dive right in. So what is homeostasis? Well, think about this. If it's 112 degrees Fahrenheit outside, what is the body temperature of a normal human being who is out in that environment? Well, you should have said somewhere around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit or 37 degrees Celsius. Now, if it's negative 12 degrees Fahrenheit outside, what is the body temperature of a normal human out in that cold? Once again, you should have said 98.6 or 37 degrees. So why is the body always at the same temperature no matter what the outside environment is doing? Well, that all comes back to homeostasis. So it's the body's or the cell's way of maintaining stable internal conditions. It's maintaining a balanced state inside the cell or inside the body. Homeo means the same and stasis means standing still. So if you break down the word, you can see its meaning. But when we're talking about homeostasis, is it really an unchanging state? Is our temperature really always 98.6 degrees? Well, it's not exactly static. It doesn't stay this exact same all the time. It's more a state of dynamic equilibrium. Dynamic meaning it's in flux, it's moving a little bit. So instead of it being a set point all the time, it's hovering around a set point all the time. So when we talk about temperature and homeostatic failures, why might the body not be at 37 degrees Celsius or 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit? Well, maybe we have a fever. Maybe we've been out in that 112 degree heat for too long and our body temperature has increased and we can't sweat enough to cool down. Maybe we fell into some icy water and we can't generate enough heat in our body in order to keep our temperature up. Maybe we just exercise. That's going to increase our body temperature because we're moving a lot and we're burning a lot of our food for energy. Maybe we're actually eating and we're digesting. That's going to require energy and require some of that heat from us, so our body temperature will drop a little bit. Alcohol and drug use will affect your body temperature. So we're never really quite at 98.6. We may be a little bit higher, we may be a little bit lower. Anything above 99 degrees Fahrenheit is considered a fever, and anything below 97 is considered hypothermia, where you're essentially like freezing to death. But the set point, the temperature that we're hoping to be at all the time is 98.6. So what is happening in these cases? Well, maybe you have a disease like we talked about. So I can't maintain homeostasis if something is wrong with the way my body regulates temperature. Maybe I need to increase that temperature in order to fix a mistake that's happening in my body, or maybe the mistake in my body, like a virus or a bacteria, is affecting my ability to maintain my temperature. But also, maybe it's the environmental extremes that we talked about, like you're out in the sun or you fall into a frozen lake, something like that. These are failures of homeostasis. They can be internal, like disease, or you have a blockage in your arteries that makes your blood pressure increase, or you can have external stimuli cause a failure of homeostasis, like temperature or chemicals, something like that. When your body cannot maintain homeostasis, we call that state disease. So we're going to dive into this a little bit more. Particularly, we're going to look at this image here on the left. What are the different parts of your body that control homeostasis for different variables, different set points like temperature or blood pressure or blood glucose, your blood sugar? And just keep in mind that we always have a healthy range for these values, and anything outside, whether too high or too low, we're no longer keeping homeostasis, and that's where we get disease. So let's take a look at this one in particular. When we talk about homeostasis, we're talking about controlling a particular variable, some factor that we want to regulate in our body. The one I've been talking about most commonly is temperature, because it's the one that seems to make the most sense when you first think about it. But we can also talk about, like I said, blood glucose, or the amount of potassium and sodium in your bodies or in your cell. So there's lots of different variables. So we have many different homeostatic pathways to regulate those variables. There's always going to be a stimulus. This is going to be some kind of change in the variable, either internally inside your body or externally. For example, with temperature, there might be an internal stimulus of a virus that I need to kill, so I'm going to stop homeostasis and increase my body temperature. Or it could be I'm exercising and my body temperature increases. Or there could be an external stimuli, such as the air conditioning goes out and my house gets really hot. So a stimulus is going to kind of set the whole homeostatic balance in motion. It's going to change that set point a little bit. The temperature may go up, your blood sugar may drop, something like that. Then some part of your body, a receptor, senses that stimulus. It senses that change. We have receptors in our skin and in our nervous system that sense temperature. And they monitor our internal temperature and they make sure that we're okay. We could also have receptors for pain. We have receptors for all these different things inside of our body. They're the ones that receive the signal that something is different, something has changed. And the input is then the information that those receptors send to the main control center. So the input is that information of, hey, it's getting hot in here, or hey, your blood sugar just really tanked. And it's sending that information to a control center. Usually with this, we're talking about your brain, your hypothalamus, or your nerves, basically that central nervous system. And the control center is going to be the one that determines, well, that's not at our set point. I want our set point to be 98.6. And it's going to analyze the input and then create a response. It's going to create an output that sends that information out of the brain back into the body. So we send that information away from the control center, that's the output, such as start sweating or dilate your blood vessels. And that's going to be sent to an effector, something that causes an effect to happen in your body. It causes a change to occur, like your sweat glands, like your blood vessels. And then that ends up creating a response. You sweat, and that will cause evaporative cooling, and your body temperature will hopefully come back down. Now, homeostasis is really regulated by the nervous system, so your brain and your nerves and the glands inside your brain, or the endocrine system. Usually it's both working in concert. The endocrine system are all of your glands that produce your hormones. So when we talk about who is in control of homeostasis, it's the nervous and endocrine systems. So here's that example of temperature. And you have a stimulus such as your body temperature rising that causes the receptors to send information to the brain. The brain says, whoa, it's too hot. I'm going to sweat. And it sends that information to the sweat glands that start to create the response of sweating, and it brings back the balance to your body temperature. It brings your body temperature back down. But the opposite can also happen. If all of a sudden my body temperature drops too much, my receptors are going to send that information to the brain. The brain is going to say, hey, that's not right. It's going to send information back to your muscles, and your muscles are going to start shivering. They're going to start doing little contractions that cause movement all over your body, and movement produces heat, which is our final response. It causes your body temperature to rise and once again restores that balance. Now we have two methods of maintaining homeostasis. The one that I just described is considered negative feedback. It is the most common way that we maintain homeostasis. This is where we're going to be negative. We're going to go against whatever is happening. If my body temperature is rising, I want to go against it and cause it to drop. This really occurs when we need to slow down or stop whatever is happening in our body. But there's another one called positive feedback. It's literally just the opposite. Instead of wanting to oppose whatever is happening, we want to make whatever's happening happen more. So we're going to exaggerate the initial stimulus. Now these are pretty rare. There's not a lot of times that we really want to see this happening in the body. However, there is a very important reason why it happens, and it's usually to keep us out of a disease state, to get something out of our body that shouldn't be there. So let's look at examples of these so we can understand them a little bit better. So negative feedback. This is the one that I said is the most common. And the best way to think of negative feedback is that temperature example, or a thermostat in your house. It works almost the same exact way. The room temperature decreases, that information is sent to a control center. That control center says, it's too cold in here, I'm going to kick on the heater, and the heater turns on, and you end up increasing the temperature of the room back to where you want it to be. Now, really, we're not going to look at minor variations when we talk about this. So if your body is 98.5, 98.4, it may not do anything too much. We're looking more at like, it's dropped to 98.2 or 98.1. We're looking at a little bit larger variations here. And the really fascinating thing is, with negative feedback, the normal set value will be slightly different for everybody. Not everybody's body is working at the same exact way. For example, heart rate. We can homeostatically control our heart rate. And some people have a significantly lower resting heart rate than others. Those are usually athletes. They're going to have much lower heart rates because their heart muscle is stronger and can pump more blood effectively in one stroke, we call it. So the average person will have a much higher heart rate than a pro athlete. Now, the good thing about negative feedback, this can be maintained for a very long time. It's a really simple mechanism. I have to quickly just adjust these particular changes that are occurring. I turn it on for a little bit. Once it gets back to normal, I turn it off. You're not running your body's systems all the time. You're only running them when you've slightly gone off course. So that's mostly why we see this occurring throughout most of our body's homeostatic systems. It's an easy, good, long-term solution to the problem. So with negative feedback, there's a stimulus, and that stimulus is going to be sensed by the sensor, which then sends the message to the control, which then sends a message to the effector to do something, either increase something or decrease something. And that's going to then change your body temperature, or for example, your blood pressure. When your blood pressure goes up, like something scares you, we're going to receive that stimulus of the scary event happening in our body in the carotids. Those are the vessels in your neck, the ones where people will put their fingers on your neck to take your pulse. Those receptors in your carotid arteries send a message straight to your brain, which isn't too far away. The brain then says, whoa, our blood pressure has gone up really high. What's going on here? We don't want it this high because it puts stress on our heart. So we're actually going to end up with a message from the brain to decrease our heart rate, bring our heart rate down. When the heart is beating less frequently, that's going to cause a drop in the blood pressure. So don't be scared. Whatever's freaked you out, we can't maintain this. We got to bring the heart rate down so that way we don't overload our circulatory system. That's how negative feedback works. Another example is your blood glucose levels, like I've mentioned. So you have a stimulus, such as a rise in your blood glucose levels. Let's say you just ate a big meal, you just had a bowl of Frosted Flakes. Well, that's a lot of sugar between the Frosted Flakes and the milk, so your blood glucose levels just increase. Well, that's going to send a message at your pancreas, the receptor, that says, I need to send some insulin into the blood, because that insulin is going to make my cells take up all that glucose, so there's not a lot of glucose in my bloodstream anymore. The cells are going to absorb it. Well, that pancreas releases insulin, and that insulin then causes the cells to take up more glucose, or even the liver to take up more glucose and store it for later, because we have to have a way to survive in case we don't get a lot of food for a while. Once we take all that glucose out of the blood, our blood glucose level drops because it's going into the cells and out of our blood. And then the body's going to say, okay, we're back to normal. Or it'll keep sending the signal, no, we're not done yet, a little bit more, send a little bit more insulin out there. When it's done, we don't secrete insulin from the pancreas anymore, and the same thing will happen in the opposite direction. If your blood glucose level drops, we want to stop producing insulin. That way our body isn't taking up too much glucose. And the example on the right is talking about red blood cell production. So let's say we don't have enough oxygen. We are in a state of hypoxemia. There's not enough oxygen in our blood. So our liver and our kidneys are going to recognize this. They're the sensors. They tell us that, hey, there's a stimulus of too little oxygen here. And they're going to create something called erythropoietin. That is the messenger that's going to travel to the bone marrow. And the bone marrow is going to receive that information and say, ooh, wow, we don't have enough blood cells to carry oxygen. We're in a low oxygen state here. That's not good. So I'm going to tell the body to increase making blood cells, making red blood cells. So we're going to cause erythropoiesis, and we're going to end up with a lot more red blood cells going around. More red blood cells means they can carry more oxygen on their little red blood cells. That means I have more oxygen in my blood and I'm back to normal. Now, those were all examples of negative feedback. There's a mistake, and I'm going to work in the opposite direction to get back to where I need to be. But we also mentioned positive feedback, where we want to increase the original stimulus. We want to make it happen more and more. A good example of this is finances. If you put money in an account, and that account gives you interest, your account is going to grow. Well, if your account grows, you'll get more interest, and that'll grow your account even more. That's a positive feedback loop. Another example is population. If the amount of people that are born increases every year, we are going to assume that the population is going to rise. If the population rises, that's more people who can have babies, so there's going to be an further increase of the number of births per year. A funny one is kind of the idea of a stampede. You have cattle that start to run because maybe a cow sees a snake and gets spooked. Well, that one cow freaks out and starts running. All the cows around it start running, and then it just is going to increase the panic and increase the panic until all of the cows are stampeding. Now, this does not require the body to continually make small adjustments. It's usually a one-off event where we just make it happen to the extreme and then we stop it. So we don't see this as a long-term solution. It happens infrequently, it's very rare, and then we turn it off once the problem is done. So it usually ends when the initial stimulus, the initial problem, goes away. So let's see some examples of that in the human body. So one of them is blood clotting. Now let's say you are working on your homework and you go to grab your papers and you're stacking them nicely, and one of them gets snagged on something and causes a nasty paper cut on your finger. Well, you just split your skin open and maybe even some little capillaries there. And now you have a break in those capillaries and blood can spill out. And you're in pain and you're angry, but your body says, well, I don't want to keep bleeding and losing this precious blood, this precious oxygen in the blood. So they have to start clotting your blood. What will happen is there are platelets inside your bloodstream that are going to find the site of that break and they're going to stick to the vessel. When that happens, the platelets actually release more chemicals that call more platelets to the area. So the platelets stick, they release chemicals that say, platelets come here, and more platelets come, more platelets stick, more chemicals get released, so more platelets come to the area, and it just keeps looping like that. And it will stop when there is no longer a damage to be fixed. When that break is completely empty and the break is completely closed, and there's no longer a stimulus of, hey, we're bleeding here, then the platelets stop releasing those chemicals. So once your blood vessel breaks, it will keep sending those signals to attract platelets until it has completely formed a clot. The other example is childbirth. So the baby, right before it's born, switches positions so that its head is pointed down, because babies are usually born head first. At least that's the way you want them to be born. And that head is going to start pushing on the cervix, which is the opening of the uterus, which connects the uterus to the vagina. And that pressure sends a signal to the mother's brain that says, okay, something is pushing on the cervix. I don't like that. I need to get this out of my body. And it tells your uterus to start contracting. The oxytocin that's produced goes all the way back down to your uterus and says, okay, squeeze, get this baby out. So the uterus is going to squeeze on the baby. That's going to push the baby even further down to push even harder on the cervix. That sends a message back up to the brain. Whoa, there's even more pressure here. So the brain is going to produce more oxytocin, which makes a stronger contraction, pushing the baby even harder into the cervix. And that's going to keep happening until finally the baby is being pushed by your uterine muscles so hard against your cervix that it opens up. The baby's head can then slip through. The whole baby then comes out, and there's now no longer a pressure on your cervix because there's no longer a baby there, and your brain is no longer getting that signal. It'll stop producing oxytocin and everything will go back to normal, except now you have a screaming baby to deal with. So, like we talked about, when you have a failure in homeostasis, we usually call that state disease. Now, what can cause failures in homeostasis? You could have a genetic abnormality, something you're born with, where your body can't produce a chemical properly, such as insulin. With diabetics, type 1 diabetics, they cannot produce insulin properly, so they have a hard time regulating their blood sugar. So their body can't do it. That means they have to control everything that they eat so that their blood sugar doesn't go crazy. Or they have to inject themselves with insulin, so their body can't make it, so they have to do it instead. Sometimes it could be injury. If you end up getting in a car accident and damaging your brain, maybe you can no longer control homeostasis as well. Maybe you got a virus like coronavirus, and it's really affecting your body's ability to breathe. So your body says, hey, I've got this virus that's not supposed to be in my body. Let's cook it. Let's increase the temperature and cause a fever. And you end up with a very high fever that kills off all the viruses or really stops them from working. And then once all the viruses have been cleared, your body temperature goes back down. Now, if you cannot fix the problem, if the damage to your brain was too severe, if the infection is too overwhelming, you may not be able to ever come back to a state of homeostasis. And in that case, you end up with death. So prolonged failure of homeostasis leads to death. Now, like I said, remember, homeostasis is a state of dynamic equilibrium. We're not always right at 98.6 degrees. We are hovering around that set point, constantly fixing it to make sure that our bodies are working at optimal levels. So that's all that I have for you guys today. If you need anything else, please feel free to reach out, email me, message me, and I will do my best to help you. Have a great day.